Welcome to Dusk, the channel where the people who work in the dark tell you what they've seen there. Tonight, I want you to think about the last time you took the subway. You walked down the stairs, you stood on the platform, you got on the train. The train moved. Tunnel walls went past the windows at speed, dark and close, and briefly lit by the light of the cars. Then another station, then more tunnel. Then you arrived somewhere, and you got off and went about your day, and you did not think about the tunnels again. Now I want you to think about what those tunnels are when you're not in them. When the last train runs at 1 or 2 in the morning and the system goes quiet, the tunnels are not empty. They are never empty, because the tunnels require maintenance that can only be performed when the trains are not running. Track inspection, rail grinding, signal work, electrical work, the constant repair of infrastructure that carries millions of people every day, and that would fail within weeks without the people who go down there in the dark and keep it running. Those people work from the end of service to the beginning of service, roughly 01 to 0500 in most major systems. 4 hours in a tunnel that is between 50 and 200 feet underground with no natural light, with the specific acoustic quality of enclosed concrete spaces that run for miles in both directions, with the knowledge that at 0500 the current goes back on the third rail and the trains start moving again. And anything that is still in the tunnel at that point has a very specific and very final problem. They work in teams usually. They communicate by radio. They are trained, experienced, careful people who take the hazard seriously and manage it with professional discipline. And some of them have stories they don't tell anyone who hasn't been down there. Tonight we bring you 3 of those stories. If you're new here, welcome. This is Dusk. Every week, the accounts from the places most of you will never go. Subscribe if you want the next one to find you automatically. It keeps this channel alive, and it costs you nothing. Now, the lights go down. Let's go. Story 1. The third rail and the man wish that's there. There are things you learn about working in subway tunnels that nobody tells you beforehand and that you only understand once you've been down there. The first is the sound. I'm not talking about the sound when the trains are running. That's obvious. That's enormous. That's something every commuter knows. I'm talking about the sound of the tunnel when the trains have stopped and the system has gone quiet for the night, because the tunnel is never silent. The ventilation runs continuously. The drainage systems run continuously. The tunnel breathes. There is a constant movement of air through the system, driven by the pressure differentials that the ventilation creates, and this air movement produces a sound that is not loud but is omnipresent, a low sighing that comes from every direction simultaneously, and that you stop consciously hearing after a few weeks, but that your nervous system never fully stops registering. The second thing is the dark. Subway tunnels have work lights, strings of bare bulbs mounted at intervals along the tunnel walls, providing enough visibility to work by. But the intervals are significant, and between the work lights the shadows are deep, and at a certain distance down the tunnel, the lights become a string of dim yellow points that give you the shape of the space without truly illuminating it. And where the tunnel curves, the lights disappear around the bend, and the curve itself is dark. The specific darkness of a curved tunnel section, where your light doesn't carry around the bend, and the bend doesn't reveal what's beyond it, is one of the more specific experiences that tunnel workers develop a relationship with over time. You learn to project beyond it, to know, based on your knowledge of the tunnel geography, what is around that curve. You learn to trust that knowledge. You learn that what's around the curve is more track, more wall, more empty tunnel, the same as what's behind you. You learn this, and most of the time it's true. I'd been doing track maintenance for 7 years when this happened. I was the senior member of a 4-person crew working the overnight maintenance window on a major urban subway line. I won't say which city because it doesn't matter. And the people involved still work there. We were doing a scheduled rail inspection on a 2-mile section of deep tunnel, the kind of inspection that requires walking the track and physically checking the rail surface, the fasteners, the ties, the condition of the ballast. Standard work. Work I had done more times than I could count. 7 years is long enough in this job to have learned the full texture of it, long enough to have been on the crew when things went wrong. A worker who misjudged a timeline and nearly didn't clear the section before a train was released. A section of track where the rail had developed a crack that could have caused a derailment if we hadn't found it. A night when a section of the tunnel ceiling shed material onto the track and we had to work around it for 3 hours while the engineers assessed the risk. Long enough to understand that the professional discipline this work requires is not bureaucratic caution. It is the accumulated understanding of what happens when that discipline breaks down. The rules exist because people died before the rules existed. I carried that understanding into every shift. It was not fear. After 7 years, fear had been replaced by something more useful, which was respect. A respect for the tunnel, and for the work, and for the specific nature of the environment that produced neither complacency nor anxiety, but a steady, calibrated attention. That night, the crew was myself, 2 track workers I'd worked with for years, and a newer man, 6 months on the job, competent but still learning the specific rhythms of tunnel work. We'd been working for about 90 minutes, moving steadily through the inspection, when we reached the section of tunnel I want to tell you about. It was a straight section, unusually long for this line, almost a quarter mile without a curve or a station. The work lights ran the length of it, which meant that from one end you could see the full distance to the other end, or as much of it as the diminishing light allowed. It was one of the tunnel sections I liked least, personally, for a reason I had never articulated to my crew and that I examined now with more clarity than I had then. A straight section that long, fully lit, should have been the most comfortable section in the tunnel. You could see everything. There were no hidden curves, no shadows around bends, no unknown geometry. The discomfort I always felt in that section came from exactly that visibility, because when you could see a quarter mile in both directions, and the tunnel was empty in both directions, and the ventilation was breathing its low, continuous note, and the work lights were doing what work lights do, there was no excuse for the specific feeling that section always produced in me. No architectural feature to blame it on. Just the tunnel, and the trek, and the lights, and the feeling. I had mentioned it once to another senior worker, a man who had been doing tunnel maintenance for over 20 years and who was as unsentimental about the work as anyone I have met. He listened to my description and was quiet for a moment and then said, "Some sections just feel wrong." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask him to. It was enough that someone else had used the same word. I'm telling you this so you understand it wasn't the first time I had felt something wrong in that section. It was just the first time the feeling was confirmed. We were approximately halfway through the straight section when my junior crew member stopped walking. I noticed because the sound of his boots on the ballast stopped, which registered even over the ventilation noise and the general background of the tunnel. I turned around. He was standing about 15 feet behind me, looking ahead of us, not at me, not at the track, but down the tunnel in the direction we were heading. I asked him what was wrong. He said, "There's someone down there." I turned and looked ahead. At the far end of the straight section, at the limit of what the work lights could illuminate, which put it at maybe 800 feet from where we stood, there was a figure, standing between the rails, facing us. We all saw it. I want to be clear about that because it matters. All 4 of us, at that point in the tunnel, saw the figure at the far end of the straight section, standing between the rails, not moving. My first response was professional. I got on the radio immediately and contacted the control center. I reported a non-authorized individual on the track in our section, gave our location, asked for confirmation of whether any other personnel had been cleared to work in our window in this section. The control center confirmed that our crew was the only authorized personnel in the tunnel that night. Nobody else had a work window in our section. I reported back to my crew. We had a protocol for this. Unauthorized individuals on track, which happened occasionally, usually people who had accessed the tunnel through maintenance hatches or emergency exits. The protocol was to halt work, maintain visual contact, call for transit police, and under no circumstances, approach alone. I maintained visual contact. The figure did not move. For the 11 minutes it took for the transit police unit to reach us via service vehicle from the nearest station, the figure stood at the far end of the straight section, in exactly the same position, between the rails, facing us, not moving in any way that I could detect from 800 feet with work lights between us. The transit police arrived. 4 officers, 2 vehicles, standard response. They moved down the tunnel ahead of us with their own lights, better lights than ours, the kind of handheld units with a real beam that cut through tunnel dark properly. They reached the far end of the straight section. There was nobody there. The officers did a thorough sweep of the area, checked the emergency exits in that section, of which there were 2, both locked from the inside, with no sign of recent use. Checked the alcoves in the tunnel wall where maintenance equipment was stored. Checked the track and the ballast for evidence of someone having been there. They found nothing. They came back to us, and the lead officer asked us to describe what we'd seen. We described it. He wrote it in his log. He told us these things happen sometimes. Tunnel workers occasionally reported visual anomalies that turned out to be tricks of the work lights and the specific optical properties of long tunnel sections, where distance and the quality of the lighting could produce perceptions that weren't there. He said it in a tone that was professional and practiced, and that I recognized from 7 years of tunnel work as the tone of someone who has given that explanation many times and who does not entirely believe it. I didn't challenge him on it. The explanation was technically possible. Distance and light quality in a long enclosed space do produce optical effects, and I would have been the first to acknowledge that as a baseline consideration. What I did not say, because saying it in an incident report would have required me to either defend it rigorously or look like I was losing my grip, was this: I had been looking at that figure for 11 minutes. Not the glance, not the peripheral impression, not the kind of brief visual event that could be explained by a trick of light. 11 minutes of sustained observation by 4 experienced workers. The figure did not flicker, did not change, did not produce the instability that characterizes optical illusions when you look at them steadily. It was simply there, and then it was not there, and the difference between those two states was absolute. We completed our inspection. I filed the incident report. It was logged as a visual anomaly, unverified unauthorized individual, transit police response, no individual found. I have locked that straight section many times since. I always look to the far end when I enter it. I always check the limit of the work lights. The figure has not been there again, but the feeling that section produces has not changed either. The specific discomfort of a tunnel that gives you everything you can see and still makes you feel like you're missing something. 3 months after that night, I mentioned the incident to one of the longest-serving workers in the department, a man who had been maintaining this line since before I was born and who had the specific authority of someone who had outlasted every explanation. He listened to the whole story without expression. When I finished, he asked me one question: was it the straight section between the 2 express stations? I said yes. He nodded, just once. He didn't say anything else, and I didn't ask him to. I stopped trying to explain that feeling a long time ago. I just keep walking. Story 2. The voice ahead of the crew. Let me tell you about radio discipline in subway tunnel work, because it is the foundation of what made this story disturbing to me in a way that went beyond the immediate experience. In a subway tunnel during a maintenance window, radio communication is not optional and it is not casual. It is a safety system. Every crew member carries a radio. Every communication is logged by the control center. The frequency assignments are specific to each work zone. Your crew is on one frequency. The adjacent crew, if there is one, is on a different frequency. The control center monitors all of them. The protocol for radio communication in tunnels is rigid. You identify yourself. You state your location using the milepost markers on the tunnel wall. You state your purpose. You do not transmit on a frequency that isn't yours. You do not use non-standard communication formats. This exists because the consequence of miscommunication in a tunnel, wrong location, misidentified crew, incorrect status, can be fatal. A crew that is reported clear of a section when they are not clear of a section, and a train that is released into service because the section is reported clear, is a situation that does not have a good outcome. The radio discipline exists to prevent that situation, and the people who work in tunnels take it with the seriousness of something that has killed people before the rules existed. I say all of this because the voice I heard was on our frequency. I had been doing tunnel signal work for 9 years. Signal work is more specialized than track inspection. It requires entering the tunnel, not just to walk the track, but to access the signal equipment that controls train movement, equipment that is mounted on the walls and in the infrastructure of the tunnel at regular intervals, equipment that requires physical inspection and sometimes hands-on repair that cannot be done remotely. Signal workers work in smaller crews than track teams, 2 or 3 people, sometimes alone for portions of the work when the task requires it. 9 years in signal work gives you a specific kind of knowledge. You know the equipment, every component, every failure mode, every way that a signal unit can behave normally and abnormally. You know why they stay. You can extend what you too, but differently, with an intimacy that track teams don't necessarily develop, because signal work brings you close to the walls, close to the infrastructure, close to the physical fabric of the tunnel in a way that walking inspection doesn't. You spend time in sections that track teams move through. You stop. You open panels. You work with your hands inside the wall of a tunnel that has been carrying trains for 100 years. You develop a relationship with the physical history of the space. I was working with one other person that night, a colleague I had worked with for 4 years, experienced and reliable. We were on a section of tunnel that ran beneath the older part of the city, one of the original lines, built in the early part of the 20th century with the architecture of a different era. The tunnels on the original lines have a different quality from the modern sections. Lower ceilings, older materials, the specific acoustic character of a space built in an era when the engineering was slightly less precise and the dimensions slightly less regular. They also have a history. In the way that very old infrastructure has history, the accumulated record of decades of use, and the things that happen in heavily used spaces over the span of a century. We had been working for about 2 hours, moving through the section in the standard leapfrog pattern, one person at the current signal unit, while the other moved ahead to the next, when I heard the voice on the radio. It was a voice I did not recognize. Male. Clear signal. Not degraded. Not the static of a radio with a weak battery, but a clean transmission as if from a radio being used correctly in normal conditions. The voice said a location, stated it in the standard format, milepost number, tunnel designation, and then said that the work was complete and the section was clear. I stopped what I was doing and listened. The transmission lasted approximately 6 seconds. In those 6 seconds, I registered several things simultaneously. The voice was using our crew's exact frequency, not an adjacent frequency, not a frequency that overlapped ours, for our specific assigned frequency for that night's work window. The milepost number it stated was approximately 400 meters ahead of my current position. The tunnel designation was correct for our section. The format, milepost, designation, status, was the exact format we used. Not a generic transit authority format, but the specific shorthand that signal crews on this line had developed over years. The transmission sounded, in other words, exactly like one of my crew calling in a clear status. Except I was standing still with my radio in my hand, and I had not transmitted. And my colleague was 400 meters ahead of me, and I had not heard her transmit, and the voice was not hers. My colleague came back to my location. I told her what I had heard. She looked at me with the expression of someone who is processing something carefully. Then she told me that 2 minutes before I called her, she had heard something on her radio as well. Not a voice. She wasn't certain enough to call it a voice. A sound. On our frequency. That lasted about 3 seconds and then stopped. We completed the work. We filed the incident report. The control center's technical team reviewed the frequency logs for our entire work window and found no unexplained transmissions. The equipment was tested. No fault was identified. The technical team's conclusion was that I had likely experienced bleed from an adjacent frequency, a signal from another crew, or from transit operations on a nearby band that had crossed into our frequency range due to an equipment anomaly. This is a documented phenomenon. It happens rarely, but it happens. What the technical explanation does not account for is the content of what I heard. A milepost number. A tunnel designation. A clear status. Stated in the exact format used by tunnel workers on that line with the specific phrasing of our crew's communication style. On our frequency, at a location ahead of where my colleague and I were working. Bleed from an adjacent frequency carries whatever is being said on that frequency. It doesn't generate content that matches the format and location and status of the crew that receives it. I have been doing signal work for 9 years. I know the difference between cross signals and a transmission on my frequency that came from somewhere I cannot account for. What I heard was a crew reporting their section clear. There was no crew in that section but us, and we had not reported clear. I have thought about what it would mean if we had acted on that transmission. If I had heard a clear status from the section ahead and reported it to the control center and the control center had released a train into the section based on that report. The section ahead was not clear. We were in it, or would have been in minutes. The consequences of that scenario are something I don't need to describe. You can work them out yourself. I don't know where the transmission came from. I don't know what produced it. What I know is that I did not act on it. I called my colleague. I called the control center. I followed procedure. And every time I work that section of the original line now, I listen to my radio a little more carefully than I used to. Not with fear, with attention. The specific attention of someone who knows that not everything that comes through on a clear frequency is what it appears to be. Story 3. The station that lost in the map. This story requires more background than the others because the background is part of what makes it what it is. Every major subway system in the world has what urban explorers and transit historians call ghost stations. Stations that were built or partially built, or that operated for a period and were then closed and sealed. New York has several. London has many. Paris has its own version. These stations exist for various reasons. Lines that were rerouted before completion. Stations that lost their traffic when neighborhoods changed. Stations that were bypassed by modernization projects and sealed rather than demolished because demolition was more complicated or more expensive than closure. The system I worked in had 3 documented ghost stations. I say documented because the existence of sealed or decommissioned stations is a matter of public record in most systems. They appear in historical records, in the engineering documentation, in the institutional memory of the transit authority. They are not secrets. They are simply closed. What I encountered on the night of this story was not one of the documented ghost stations. I'd been doing tunnel work for 11 years, the last 5 on a specialized crew that handled what the authority called deep infrastructure. The older sections of the system, the original lines, the sections that required workers with experience of older technology and non-standard tunnel configurations. We were the crew that went into the parts of the system that the regular maintenance teams flagged as requiring specialized attention. In 11 years, I had developed an encyclopedic knowledge of the system's physical layout. I knew the tunnel maps, the station locations, the service passages, the utility corridors, the cross passages that connected parallel lines. I knew the ghost stations. I had been in 2 of them during scheduled infrastructure inspections. They were sealed, stripped of signage and equipment, their platforms dark and their access points locked, exactly what you would expect a decommissioned station to look like. On a night in February, I was working alone on a section of the oldest tunnel line, a single-person signal inspection that I had done 3 times before on the same section. The section ran between 2 active stations, a distance of about a mile, straight and well documented. I knew every feature of it. I had mapped it myself on the first inspection. As I did with all sections I worked regularly. I was approximately 2/3 through the section when my work light caught something on the right-hand wall of the tunnel that I did not recognize. It was a platform edge, not the edge of a regular station platform. Not that this location, there was no station at this location. The nearest active station was a 1/4 mile in either direction. But a platform edge, unmistakably, the specific raised concrete lip, the tactile warning strip along the edge, the geometry of a space designed for passengers to stand and wait for a train. I stopped. I pointed my light along the wall. The platform extended for what I estimated at roughly 60 feet, the length of a short station platform. The wall behind the platform was tiled. I could see the tiles in my beam from the track level. White ceramic tiles, the kind used in subway stations of a certain era. Dirty and dusty, with years of disuse but intact. At the center of the platform, on the wall, there was a sign. I could not read the sign from the track. The dust on the tiles and the angle of my light didn't allow it. I stood on the track and looked at the sign and tried to resolve it and could not. I know what protocol required. Protocol required that I report the discovery to the control center immediately, remain at location, and await instructions. That is what protocol required, and I know it and I did not follow it. I stepped up onto the platform. The platform surface was concrete, dusty with decades of tunnel particulate, undisturbed. My boots left clean prints in the dust as I moved toward the center of the platform. The tiled wall behind me extended the full length of the platform and was continuous. No doors, no access passages, no openings of any kind. The platform was a sealed pocket in the tunnel wall, accessible only from the track. I reached the sign on the wall. It was the station name sign, the standard format used by this system, the station name and the system's typography on a background in the system's colors. I read the name. I had never heard of the station. In 11 years of working the system, with the level of institutional knowledge I had accumulated about its history and its geography, I had never encountered this name. Not in the documentation, not in the historical records, not in the engineering maps, not in the informal institutional memory of the authority's long-term employees. I stood on the platform of a station whose name I did not recognize, in a location that was not on any map I had ever seen, and I took a photograph of the sign with my phone. Then I stepped back down to the track and called the control center and reported what I had found. The control center's response was not what I expected. They did not ask me to describe what I had found. They did not ask for my exact milepost location. The supervisor on duty told me to complete my inspection, return to the entry point, and come to the authority's operations center at the end of my shift for a debrief. The debrief lasted 2 hours. I was interviewed by 3 people, one of whom I had never seen before and who was not introduced to me by name or role. I was asked to describe everything I had seen in precise detail. The location, the dimensions I could estimate, the tile work, the platform edge, the length, the condition of the surfaces. I answered everything fully and precisely because I had nothing to conceal and because I understood from the atmosphere of that room that the quality of my account was being assessed as carefully as its content. My phone was examined and the photograph was confirmed. They could see it. They could see the platform. They could see the sign. The photograph was retained by the authority. I was told I would receive a copy through official channels. I have not received it. I was told that the station I had found was a documented infrastructure feature of the original line's construction, a partial station that had been built and then sealed before the line opened, for reasons that were described to me as engineering reallocation. I was told it appeared on internal maps that were not in general circulation. I was told that my discovery had been logged and that the access point would be reviewed for proper sealing. I was not told the name on the sign. I already knew it, of course. I had read it and I remembered it, but I was not asked about it, and I did not raise it, because something about the atmosphere of that 2-hour debrief told me that the name was the part of this that was being managed most carefully. The person who was not introduced asked me, near the end of the debrief, whether I had told anyone else about what I had found. I said no. They noted this. They told me that the discovery was an internal infrastructure matter and that discussing it publicly could compromise ongoing structural assessment work. They asked me to keep the matter confidential until the official review was complete. I agreed. I am not in breach of that agreement by telling you this story, because no official review was ever communicated to me, and the confidentiality request expired with my employment at the authority, which ended 14 months after the debrief, when I was transferred to a different department in a different part of the system, with a commute that was not workable and a role that did not use any of my specialized experience, and I resigned. I have done my own research since. The name on the sign does not appear in any public record of this system's history that I have been able to find. It does not appear in newspaper archives from the periods when the original line was being planned and constructed. It does not appear in the authority's publicly available historical documentation. I have spoken to 3 transit historians who specialize in this system's development. None of them recognize the name. One of them, the most thorough of the 3, a person who has been researching this system's history for over 20 years, told me that if a station by that name had been planned and partially built, there should be a record of it somewhere. Planning documents, engineering specifications, budget allocations, at minimum, an entry in the project logs that were kept throughout the original line's construction. There is no such record that any of us can find. There are a few possible explanations. The name was assigned internally and never publicized because the station never opened. The records were archived in a category that historians don't have access to. The specific documentation of that station was not preserved when the authorities' records were digitized decades ago. Those are the clean explanations. They're all possible. What I think about, though, is the debrief. The 2 hours. The person who was not introduced. The specific way the questions were structured. Thorough about everything I saw. Careful about everything I said. And entirely silent on the subject of the name I had read on the wall of a platform that no map acknowledged. I think about what it means to seal a station before a line opens. To build a platform, tile the walls, install the signage. The sign was not a temporary label. It was the finished sign, the permanent sign, the sign that would have been there for passengers if passengers had ever stood on that platform, and then seal the access and remove it from the public record. I think about the dust on that platform floor, undisturbed for decades, and my boot prints moving through it toward the sign. I think about the name on the sign. I have not been back to that section since the debrief. The authority reassigned me to a different line without explanation 2 weeks after the incident. I have never seen the photograph again. 3 tunnels, 3 nights, 3 people in the infrastructure that moves millions of people through the city while those millions sleep. There is something specific about subway tunnel work that I want to name before we close tonight, because I think it's the thing that connects these 3 accounts more than anything else. When you are in a subway tunnel during the maintenance window, you are in a space that exists in 2 completely different states. In its operational state, the 16 or 18 hours of service, the trains, the passengers, the noise and the light and the constant movement. The tunnel is one of the most heavily human-occupied environments that exists. Millions of interactions, millions of journeys, the full density of urban life compressed into underground corridors. And then service ends, and the tunnel becomes something else. The same physical space, the same dimensions, the same walls and track and infrastructure, but now occupied only by the people who maintain it. A handful of workers spread across miles of tunnel, in the specific silence of a system that is paused. What I think the accounts tonight describe is that transition. The moment when a space that is saturated with human presence for most of its existence becomes empty. Not fully empty, never fully empty, but suddenly much closer to empty than it ever is when the trains are running. Something remains in that space that the ventilation and the work lights and the professional discipline of the maintenance crews does not fully account for. Not in every tunnel, not on every night, but sometimes. A figure at the far end of a straight section, standing between the rails, visible to 4 experienced workers, present and then not present. A voice on a frequency, in the correct format, from a location that was unmanned, logged by no equipment that should have captured it. A platform with a name that does not appear in any record that the public can access, found and documented, and then managed by people who asked every question except the obvious one. I have been thinking about what it would mean if the tunnels held something of what moved through them. Not consciously, not deliberately, just the way that very old and very heavily used spaces sometimes seem to hold something of their use. The energy of it, the accumulated weight of all the human presence that has moved through them over decades. Most of the time, that's just a way of talking about a feeling, an atmosphere, something that isn't real in any technical sense. And then there are the nights when a crew of 4 stops walking and looks to the end of a tunnel and sees something standing there between the rails. And you think, maybe some of what moves through here doesn't always get off at the next stop. This is Iron Dusk. Every week, accounts from the people who work in the places that keep everything running while you sleep. The tunnels, the towers, the deep water, the polar dark. If you want to keep hearing these, subscribe. 3 seconds and the next story finds you automatically. And if you've worked the tunnel maintenance window, if something happened down there in the 4 hours between last train and first train that you've never been able to account for, you know where to find me. Sleep well, or don't.